District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I am your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. This is a special episode of District of Conservation, coming a little irregular from our Monday or Tuesday postings, but because of this breaking news out of Nantucket, Massachusetts, with this Vineyard Wind 1 project collapsing and pushing debris onto all these pristine, beautiful coasts that a lot of people are very familiar with, I brought on two of the best people I could think of, two phenomenal ladies in the commercial fishing side who've been fighting offshore wind and warning people all across the country, and especially in New England, about the dangers of this agenda. So Bonnie and Meghan, thank you both for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
First, for those who are unfamiliar with both of your backgrounds, could you briefly explain and elaborate who you are and why offshore wind has animated you to get involved?
You want to take that one first, Meghan?
Sure. My name is Meghan Lapp. I'm the fisheries liaison for Seafreeze. We are a commercial fishing company in Rhode Island. We own and operate 5 federally permitted commercial fishing vessels and 2 shoreside facilities. And we also service many owner-operated commercial vessels. I'm involved in anything regulatory that involves commercial fishing. I'm an advisor on 6 advisory panels for the New England Fisheries Management Council, Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council, and Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And I really got involved with offshore wind when I saw the threat that it was going to pose to our vessels and to commercial fisheries on the East Coast of the United States. Basically, it's no-go zones for us. It's going to have tremendous environmental damage from these projects. And if everything goes as planned, as the current Biden administration wants it to go, there won't be commercial fishing on the East Coast of the U.S. In 20 years, and you'll be eating all your seafood from China. And so that's what motivated me to fight it. And it has been a very, very long uphill battle, but it looks like we might finally be starting to turn the tide a little bit.
And I'm Bonnie Brady. I'm the executive director of the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association, a position I've done since 2001. We had on Long Island our first attempt at 200 megawatts, 100 2-megawatt turbines in state waters south of Jones Beach on Long Island. And that was my introduction to offshore wind. And I've been battling ever since. Meghan and I together, what are we at 8 years, Meghan? Something like that, I think. I also am an advisory panel member on 3 advisory panels for the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council and 3 for the New England Fishery Management Council. And basically, once you learn about offshore wind, as I had someone tell me once, you've never met someone that you meet plenty of people that were for offshore wind until they started reading about it. And then they became against it once they found out what it really did. You never have people going from the camp of anti and then suddenly thinking it's the best thing ever, because it isn't. And this is fight or die time. That's where we're at.
It really is. And I've drawn a lot of attention to offshore wind as a recreational angler and as someone who loves to go to the beach. And I study energy very extensively. It's part of my work as a professional. And you look at this and let's give them deference or play devil's advocate as do we consider them? I look at them. They are to me very invasive structures. I don't even know how much pound of concrete goes into them. They're still relying on fossil fuels. Ironically, they say they're going to be moving away from it. They produce 0 emissions, but everything that's a derivative of it is still going to consume, if not use more than conventional energy sources. It's also reliable if you're lucky. 35, maybe 45% of the year. They claim they have a shelf life of 20. Doesn't always live up to that. There's so many, I would say, drawbacks and cons to this, yet we still continue to see, and for those who are unfamiliar, offshore wind is heavily subsidized by the federal government. There's not much of market orientation in favor towards these. There's a lot of subsidies, a lot of communities have been bought off by these different companies, state governments, and even the feds. to push this ahead. So I have, of course, spoken to Meghan at length. I've spoken to Bonnie many times privately, now having her on the show. But I've just become so against it because it's not a good energy source. And the environmental, I would say, trade-offs are even worse than anything that we use currently in terms of energy sources. And so why haven't most people in elected positions recognized this or conceded this yet? Because in New England, it seems like most of the politicians are still double downing on this. What do you make of this in terms of it being an energy source that they're claiming is the future, while it potentially has a lot of these huge environmental drawbacks?
It's all about money. It has nothing to do about energy. It has to do with money and political power. As people continue to clamor about the quote unquote climate crisis, when they say, oh, well, we're going to do these projects and general public is like, oh, well, it's going to solve everything, which, as you just pointed out, it's not going to. There's huge, political power in that. People think it's going to get them votes. And a lot of people's pockets are getting lined as well. I know Bonnie can speak to this very, very in depth, but you have politicians who maybe have hedge funds or are involved with people that have hedge funds, and the investable tax credits that come with these projects, they get monetized, and they get monetized by those types of financial entities. So I'll let Bonnie speak to it because she is the consummate expert on this subject.
Gee, thanks. It's a combo of the Emperor's New Wind Clothes salesman and the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Nothing is what it appears. Most of it is PR. And now the folks of Nantucket are finding out the reality. We've got, it started out the original Vineyard Wind project when it was initially the petition for a lease that was part of Vineyard Power on Martha's Vineyard. The fellow who headed it, Richard Andre, was an energy guy, and he brought the group there that was interested in more renewable power, along with Blackstone, that showed up and offered the 80% share. And as soon as the project was leased, 3 weeks later, they sold it to Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. There are Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners was created by one of the tranches of Pension Denmark, which is one of the largest labor pension funds in Denmark. They were all former Danish Oil and Natural Gas, now known as Ørsted, employees. It's a giant circle jerk of large sums of money, sprinkle in some, in the case of the US IRA funding, and guarantee 18% return, which was happening back in like the 2000s, especially in the UK because of the mandates. And suddenly everyone thinks it's the best thing ever without actually taking the time to read the fine details. And that's where we're at right now. We're looking at them.
Last year, the offshore wind industry almost collapsed, even with the boosting and help of Inflation Reduction Act, which is Green New Deal Light subsidies. I think it was a 60% at least market share decrease on Wall Street. On the New York Stock Exchange, you saw Ørsted and others stock plummet, and it's not in good shape. And now you have what has been transpiring in Nantucket. I would like you both to speak to what has happened there a little bit more on Vineyard Wind, one, and the significance of this and the fallout from this disaster and kind of the concealing by, I believe, the Copenhagen investors are involved in this with GE as well. And these are very exorbitant projects. They cost a lot of money. They've been pushed onto local communities. A lot of local opposition has been ignored, and they just steamroll and proceed ahead with these. So could you speak to what is happening and unfolding in Nantucket?
Meghan, do you want me to take an initial stab and then you can close out on this one? Or right. Well, Nantucket, the town of Nantucket on their website has a specific item regarding today's gift from Vineyard Wind. Basically, it's an update. They talk about half the fiberglass shell has still remained, and that Vineyard Wind is now BSEE, which is the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, is the lead regulator for safety. They are on the scene, but they're not actually on the scene. They're in New Bedford. As far as in the project, I believe they've got a 500-yard buffer zone, safety zone, so to no one to enter the area. And I just saw about 30 minutes ago, apparently pieces of the turbine have landed on a small island near Chappaquiddick in Wask. And so, it was kind of humorous because they were talking about they were using the NOAA models to determine where the current was, but yet this stuff is everywhere. I mean, they didn't really let anyone know. Apparently, Bessie, according to the New Bedford Light, issued them a stop work order on Saturday, but no one told anyone until Monday. And I mean, it's just been shocking that many people were left in the dark until the stuff started landing on the shores. It's just been, and you've probably seen the pictures online.
They're harrowing.
I'm sorry?
They're harrowing. Scary to look at, yeah.
That, they've got these poor kids that are lifeguards that are dragging in. There was a woman, I don't know, that you can probably afterward include the links, but the town in Nantucket had a select board meeting. Oh gosh, when was that? 2 nights ago? And they spoke, one woman who clearly was related to someone who was a lifeguard is talking about, these giant 200-pound pieces of fiberglass, which if anyone's dealt with fiberglass, you can cut the goodness gracious out of your hands, and dragging that sort of thing on the beach. And they had no gloves, they had no protection, nothing. And those kids were supposedly, it seemed, more of the overall safety group than the supposed 2 teams of 4 coming from Vineyard Wind. I mean, it's just been a certain kind of show that I can't say in mixed company since the beginning, and it doesn't seem to be getting better.
Meghan, before I have you expand a little bit, how many turbines have been installed? Because I've seen the proposal. I think it's 62 they're planning to put online, and I don't know how many are on, and I hope you can clarify. And I think it's estimated to cost $2.3 to $2.8 billion to do this. So is this the sole turbine that is operating? Because I think I saw it went into operation in January of this year. So how many are in operation? Was this the only one that collapsed, or are there others?
So the project is still under construction. That's what's kind of ironic. It's not even built yet, and it's already breaking. The total project, yes, is for like 62 turbines and a substation. And I believe they have pile driven, like they have to take a giant pole essentially and slam it into the ocean floor. And then they build the turbine on top of that. They still have 15 left to pile drive. They have some of the towers and the blades up on the ones that they've already pile driven, but not all of them. I think, a very small handful of them, quote unquote, went into operation earlier this year, but the majority of them are still under construction or have not been built yet. And so basically this one turbine, they were putting the blades up, they had them up, and on Saturday evening, one of the blades, now you have to understand the size of these, they're bigger than a football field, they're 107 meters long. It just collapsed and pieces went into the water. Vineyard Wind did not notify the town of Nantucket until 5 p.m. on Monday evening. So for 48 hours, there was debris from that turbine in the water and floating towards Nantucket in the water column, and nobody was told. And that really put a lot of people in a safety situation. There could be giant pieces, floating around that somebody hits in a boat, or people swimming on the ocean side of the island. I mean, there can be decent waves there. There's surfing, there's breakers, and there were giant pieces of fiberglass in that water. People could have really gotten hurt or killed. And as Bonnie said, on Wednesday night, the town held a public hearing on it, and people were furious. They were furious. They felt that it was a cover-up, that nobody told them, immediately. There were, as Bonnie mentioned, locals and lifeguards and things like that pulling pieces of fiberglass out of the water, trying to clean it up, as well as trying to make it more safe. Immediately then on Monday, once they were notified, the town closed the beaches, and then they reopened them a day or two later. But it's interesting because they have a notice that says, but if you go to the beach, make sure you wear shoes because there's still fiberglass there, and don't bring your pets. So somehow it's okay to swim in this water, but it's not okay to wear shoes on the beach or bring your pets there because they might just get fiberglass all on their feet or, so anyway, that is what it is. And then yesterday, another 300-foot piece fell off the blade because not all of it fell off at once. Like the blade snapped and it was kind of hanging there. And there was a bunch of crap that went into the water on Saturday, which was then washing up on Nantucket. And then, but there was still a lot of it left. Well, partway through the meeting on Wednesday night, the CEO of Vineyard Wind, who was present, had to leave because they had kind of an emerging situation that was an emergency. So what had happened is they said, well, more debris has fallen in the water and it looks like, the rest of it is imminent to go in the water. And then the next morning, the Coast Guard put out a notice to mariners saying there was a 300-foot piece of fiberglass in the water. And so was warning people about that. Part of it is still up on the turbine now. That 300-foot piece has supposedly sunk, but there's still debris, as Bonnie said, washing up different places. I think now the wind has changed, but this stuff is everywhere. And this is only one blade, one incident. And on Wednesday, some of the town council asked, well, like, how often does this happen? Is this a unique event, or does this actually happen all the time? Because there's like 1,000 windmills planned for this massive lease block south of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And they were not given any answers. But as it really turns out, one of these same blades broke off of the coast of the UK in May of this year. And then even a couple years ago, there was a large blade on an offshore wind turbine that snapped off Denmark. And there was immediate no-go zones and safety zones that went up and things like that. And I mean, obviously, wind developers know this. This is a fairly frequent occurrence that, people need to be aware of. And I think what's really hitting home now is the fact that this area is a beach economy. It's a summer tourism economy in a lot of ways. In a lot of areas, particularly places like Nantucket. And then what happens when you have to close all your beaches in the height of summer because of an incident like this? I mean, the impacts are tremendous. There was one guy from Nantucket. He's a surf instructor. He has 25 employees, and he had to close his business down because the beaches were closed. And then, even when it reopened, everybody canceled. Nobody wanted, to go into the water because they're scared of shards of fiberglass. And then, his employees are all asking him, well, like, what happens and what happens to our paychecks and our, where do we go from here? Right? Because he has to make all his money in June, July, and August. That's how it works in New England. And there was no answers for him or for anybody else. So the impact to the economy in this area is going to be tremendous. And that doesn't even go into all the other details. They say it's not toxic. Well, fiberglass is kind of toxic. And if there's microplastics everywhere, what does that do? There's a lot of unanswered questions. And I really hope that this wakes people up so that they know, hey, this is what you get when you get offshore wind. These types of things. Are you willing to risk it?
Right, because a lot of people who are supportive of offshore wind will dismiss opposition as well. It's just these NIMBYs who don't want their views obstructed. But it's a lot more than that. It's not just homeowners concerned, and they have absolutely right to be concerned about this as well. But you have, like you said, different small businesses that are dependent upon this outdoor recreation economy or beach economy. You have lobstermen. There was one lobsterman who was very impassioned. I liked his remarks. He was great. He talked about the areas becoming no-go zones, essentially, where these turbines are installed. You had a recreational angler who talked about navigation systems being interrupted. He couldn't see, where all this was happening. So you had commercial, recreational, surfers, all these other, subsidiary sectors of the economy dependent upon having a clean and pristine beach area. But it's going to be arguably destroyed if more of these turbines definitely come on shore. But what is the recourse that these people in Nantucket have? What have you both heard on the ground from any contacts you have there or any of the individuals who've spoken at these meetings? Are they going to be suing Vineyard Wind here, or what's the next step that they're going to do to get recourse here?
I mean, I believe I saw on the town's website earlier when I was looking at it, I thought they had talked about that they were looking at a town meeting to discuss this further, but I'd have to go back and check. I do know that, as far as my first thing is the PR, again, for Vineyard Wind, this is the material is non-toxic. Well, not according to the CDC, it's not. They literally refer to it as fibrous glass, which obviously is fiberglass, can harm the eyes, skin, and the lungs. Workers may be harmed from exposure to fibrous glass. The level of exposure depends upon the dose, duration, and work being done. I mean, I sat almost gobsmacked watching that thing where the person who is the head of Vineyard Wind referred to it as, it's completely non-toxic. And literally half of the room just started, coughing uncontrollably. They were quite upset. And I would highly suggest anyone can watch that on the town Nantucket. They had this special thing. As far as in what they're going to do, I mean, Meghan spoke quite eloquently at the select board hearing, referring to, fishermen, environmental catastrophes, there's no recourse whatsoever. And I have heard rumblings that some folks, the idea that Vineyard Wind is going to make all things true to all people was great as a concept, but I can tell people from a fisheries aspect from New York, and obviously the other states that have a supposed compensation plan, it is not even close to being satisfactory. So that's where I'm coming from. Go ahead, Meghan. You can talk about what you said. You were great that night.
Yeah. So, Vineyard Wind's representatives, as Bonnie mentioned, they denied that anything was toxic or anything like that. And some of the town select board asked, well, what about like PFAS and, toxins that are in the plastic of fiberglass and things like that? So I said, hey, and Vineyard Wind wouldn't answer them. So when they went to public comment and questions, I said, Vineyard Wind wouldn't answer about PFAS and microplastics potentially getting into the water column. But if those toxins end up in seafood products, for example, filter feeders such as sea scallops, how will Vineyard Wind compensate the commercial fishing industry? And Vineyard Wind representatives have made it very clear that the current fishery compensation plans do not compensate for environmental damage because Vineyard Wind didn't expect any environmental damage. And also to take money from those compensation funds that, are grossly inadequate and which do not compensate for environmental damage like this, fishermen are required by Vineyard Wind to sign a waiver releasing Vineyard Wind from all liability, including environmental damage. So if you have a situation where the PFAS ends up in seafood, how does Vineyard Wind plan to compensate for something like that if the seafood gets contaminated, especially for fishermen who have already signed that waiver out of desperation? And of course, there were no answers because at that point, the CEO had run out of the room and the people who were still there, had zero answers. But these are all very real questions. These are issues that Bonnie and I and others in the fishing industry for so many years have raised. Developers would deny that there's any impacts. There's no impacts to the environment. There's no impacts to this. Well, guess what? There are. And how do you plan to deal with a situation like this? There was never a contingency fund for what if there's some kind of disaster. And I agree with Bonnie. I don't think that anybody will probably get Vineyard Wind certainly isn't just going to give the money. I can tell you that. They may have to do a class action lawsuit to try to recover some kind of damages here. But I think the entire situation was handled so poorly. And I think this is the rude awakening of the reality of offshore wind that people are finally waking up to.
And I think the elevation of the story by Barstool founder Dave Portnoy, because I think he has a vested interest. He has property in Nantucket. And I think someone like him who isn't really plugged into the conversation so much, him kind of shining a light on it and roasting Vineyard when he said they need to close. He said it's not environmentally friendly and that they are actually worsening the environment. Do you think this could be a turning point? Because both of you have been on TV. Meghan, I've featured you in my most recent report on offshore wind. You both do a lot of appearances. You've done national TV. A lot of people had started to understand, but there was still a lot of pushback to opposition to offshore wind. But I feel like this is a turning point because this is something you can't put back in a bottle.
Absolutely. These pictures are going to be going for quite some time. And don't forget, there's still a giant piece of the blade up there too. So that's going to come down at some point. But go ahead, Bonnie.
No, I was just going to say the Nantucket current has really been, and I wasn't even familiar with that. I think it's an electronic paper. I'm not sure if it's actually got a paper version on Nantucket, but they've been right at the heart of it. I mean, they put out some pictures that really show what's going on. This blade is peeling like a banana. And I mean, people that have not been engaged to date, because let's face it, most people expect, turn on something, you want energy, you get it. They don't expect to not be able to walk on their beach or have to get shoes for their dog. I mean, this is the reality. It's all the things that Meghan and I have been talking about. I mean, I spoke at the Nantucket hearing, and I spoke specifically. They did a study, G-Cube, who is an insurer of offshore and onshore wind turbines in Europe and other places. And they did a report in 2014 called Breaking Blades, where they said there were, at that time, 700,000 wind turbine blades and approximately 3,800 blade failures a year. So it's not a matter of not happening, it's just a matter of when. And they talk about all kinds of differences between the first year, what makes them fall and go down. GE has had this problem before. Siemens has had a huge problem and I think they had to actually close, and they were stopping making blades for a while because they had such structural issues. I believe that was them that talked about it last year. But I mean, these are issues that were highlighted also when G-Cube did a report that if anyone has on their hands, they could send me a copy, because I have to be either a wind company or some other entity or an insurer in order to get a copy. But it spoke to the fact that when it's too big to fail, and ultimately in their report, they said that anything larger than 8 megawatts was failing within 2 years. They're just trying to, bigger and better, but there's no controls, there's no quality control. They're just trying to put them up there as fast as they can. And unfortunately, we're seeing what that means right now, up close and personal. I mean, I feel horrible for the people in Nantucket, but what Meghan and I have been saying for years, this is not clean and this is not green, is unfortunately, someone mentioned about, it's green, the foam. Yeah. It's just, but it's a horrible wake-up call. And hopefully people will start to understand. I mentioned somewhere else, God knows where, no energy source wears a halo. But in the case of these turbines, you not only can destroy, obviously, what's on land, but what's in the ocean too.
It really is such a nightmare. And this philosophy of we're going to save the environment by destroying it makes no sense, especially when you get to the bottom of it. And this is case example of this. Ladies, you both have a lawsuit. You've been in litigation for some time. Could you give my listeners an update as to what has transpired or what's the latest there?
Sure. So we lost at the district court. We're up in Boston. And so we appealed that, and we go to the Court of Appeals next Thursday. And we will see what that court, does with our case.
And if those listening want to learn more about your efforts, follow you both individually, where would you like to direct them to?
Well, we both have very active Facebook pages.
and I have such a very active a Twitter page that I got blocked by Orsted yesterday because they were announcing, or on Wednesday, of how exciting, and we're doing the Sunrise Wind project. That first, when they do the shovel ready, except it's not outdoors, and they carry the dirt in and they all stand on a stage and they smile. And so I reminded those folks that maybe instead of, I can't recall exactly what I said, but it was something along the lines of, maybe they want to save those shovels and invest in some Tyvek outfits and gloves, because they may need them when one of their blades implodes, like what happened with Vineyard Wind, in addition to having a cooling water intake system that is an open cooling water and intake system that adds chlorination and will suck up 8.1 million gallons of seawater daily and release it as 90-degree effluent into the water column. So there's so much more to look forward to. Yeah.
I finally get congressional hearings, because Jeff Van Drew out of New Jersey has long demanded that these companies need to be held accountable. Is there any kind of chatter about that potentially in wake of what's happened in Nantucket?
Well, I think it's too early really to say because there's conventions and stuff this week that people are busy with, while this Nantucket situation has been unfolding. I can say that there had been a potential hearing scheduled earlier last year that was then canceled. And so we haven't really, gotten anywhere with Congress per se. Excuse me. So we'll have to see, but I do know Congressman Van Drew put out a statement about this development on Nantucket. I think a lot of eyes are going to be on this going forward, like you said, but I think it's probably going to happen after the Republican National Convention wraps up.
Yeah, and with the fallout with the would-be assassination attempt on former President Trump, too, there's been a lot in the news cycle. So I don't think Congress is going to take up this issue immediately. But I think there is now some kind of renewed interest in this. And you both have been extremely on top of this. I really appreciate your insight into this and the text messages and keeping me up to speed about what's happening. So I hope we can revisit. I know the updates are not necessarily positive, and maybe we'll have some positive updates. But anything from Nantucket or another project collapses like this, I'd like to have you both on again, since you both are a repository of information and you know this issue in and out, and you see the firsthand effects in your respective areas in the Mid-Atlantic and New England and just the Northeast in general. So ladies, I appreciate you both coming on here, and I hope this gets out far and wide to people so they know what's happening.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much.
If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.